Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to take you on a journey today. We're going to be digging into the fascinating anatomy of the English ghost story, tracing its incredible evolution all the way from ancient spoken campfire tales right up to the television terrors that honestly still keep us up at night.
So I want you to just picture this for a second. Have you ever felt a sudden, icy chill, or sworn you saw a shadow move just out of the corner of your eye when you were home alone? You know that creeping dread? That deeply unsettling feeling of being watched in your own safe space? Well, that is exactly what the very best English ghost stories tap into. It's a highly specific flavor of fear that really defines the horror story in the English language.
Okay, let's dive into this. First up, we're going to look at real ghosts of history. Then, we'll see how the Golden Age begins, dissect the anatomy of English horror, meet the masters of the macabre, and finally, wrap up with the Jamesian legacy.
Section 1. Real Ghosts of History, from Ancient Sparta to the White House.
You see, before these tales were formalized into the Victorian literature we know today, they weren't just made-up fiction. They were based on deeply rooted human beliefs and very real historical figures. The whole concept of a lingering spirit is ancient, and it's tied directly to real-world events. Way back in 470 BC, the Spartan military commander Pausanias was walled up alive to starve in a temple, and his vengeful ghost famously became a massive part of local lore. Fast forward to 1536. Anne Boleyn is brutally beheaded, and sure enough, her headless specter is subsequently spotted roaming the Tower of London. And this isn't just some ancient or European phenomenon either. Right after Abraham Lincoln's tragic assassination in 1865, sightings of his ghost pacing the White House sprang up almost immediately.
Are you noticing a pattern here? As Mental Floss points out, hauntings are often associated with violent deaths. This brilliantly illustrates a global truth in folklore. Across cultures all over the world, restless spirits are almost always tied to sudden, violent ends. And this underlying human belief system set the perfect, fertile foundation for fictional horror to eventually take root.
Section 2. The Golden Age begins. The Victorian shift in terror. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is where we see a major shift in the way terror was actually presented. Early Gothic novels like Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, well, they were set in distant times, in ancient ruins, and to be honest, they were incredibly melodramatic. But the Victorians completely flipped the script. After all, you didn't need to travel to some ruined, drafty Transylvanian castle to get a good scare anymore. They brought the horror right into modern, familiar domestic settings, starring everyday, middle-class protagonists. The horror wasn't locked away in a faraway fortress. It was sitting right there on the sofa in your own living room.
So how did those ghosts actually get into the living room? Basically, through periodicals. The rise of pulp magazines and affordable periodicals popularized the supernatural like never before. Charles Dickens was a massive champion of this. He packed the Christmas editions of his magazines, like All the Year Round, just full of spooky tales. Because of this, gathering around the fire on a cold, dark night to read a scary story out loud became a huge and somewhat ominous cultural staple for the middle class.
Section 3. Anatomy of English Horror. The mechanics of the scare.
Let's lift the hood to a second and really dissect these psychological mechanics. Like, why are these stories so uniquely terrifying? The absolutely crucial point here is verisimilitude, the pretense of truth. Authors didn't just tell a scary story, they framed it as reality. They used frame narratives, pretending the text you were holding was actually a found secret diary, or maybe a transcript from a totally impartial eyewitness. By presenting the horror as documented fact, these authors successfully bypassed our rational defenses. And to double down on this pretense of truth, they frequently used the skeptical narrator. Think of the narrator in Dickens' famous story, The Signal Man. The guy actively doubts the supernatural phenomena, right? He's desperately trying to find rational, logical explanations for everything happening. Because that narrator is mirroring your own logic and skepticism as the reader. When that terrifying climax finally hits and it simply cannot be rationally explained, man, the horror feels incredibly real.
Scholar Frank Kaufman actually boils all this down to 5 key features that make up the anatomy of this genre. We just saw the pretense of truth, but beyond that, the main goal was a pleasing terror. This means atmosphere over gore, with absolutely no gratuitous bloodshed. There's also no scientific explanation of the supernatural machinery. It just exists. Deal with it. And finally, by placing these stories in the settings of the reader's own day, the horror becomes uncomfortably relatable.
Section 4.
Masters of the Macabre, the authors who codified the chills.
So who were the brilliant minds actually utilizing these mechanics to build the foundation of supernatural fiction? It was a wonderfully diverse and talented group. We have Charles Dickens, who famously used these oppressive industrial railway settings to breed terror. Then we have Elizabeth Gaskell, who brilliantly utilized the female Gothic to explore domestic anxieties, literally terrifying us with a spooky phantom child crying outside a winter window. And we also have incredibly prolific writers like Charlotte Riddle and E.F. Benson pushing the boundaries of what the ghost story could even be.
Speaking of E.F. Benson, just listen to this visceral quote from his story The Thing in the Hall. It was like the shadow of some enormous slug, legless and fat. Yikes, right? This shows exactly how authors were evolving the genre. They were moving way past the old cliches of clanking chains and white sheets into something much stranger, deeply atmospheric, and relying on unsettling, almost cosmic visuals. It leaves so much to the imagination, which is exactly where true fear lives.
Section 5. The Jamesian Legacy, M.R. James and the Modern Adaptation.
We literally cannot talk about the horror story in the English language without bringing up M.R. James. He is arguably the single most influential writer of the entire English ghost story canon. James was an academic who famously read ghost stories to his students on Christmas Eve, and he developed this highly effective, very strict formula. First, you need a quaint English village or a university setting. Second, a slightly naive gentleman scholar as your protagonist. Third, an antiquarian object, maybe an old book or a crown, that accidentally unlocks a menace. And his absolute strictest rule of all, the spirits must be malevolent. Never amiable, never helpful, just pure, unadulterated malice.
James himself actually explained his mastery by saying, "Two ingredients most valuable in the concocting of a ghost story are, to me, the atmosphere and the nicely managed crescendo." The guy was an absolute master of pacing. He would start the story so placidly, really lulling you into a false sense of security, and then just let the ominous thing intrude unobtrusively before it completely took over the stage in a terrifying, inescapable crescendo.
And these horror mechanics were so structurally perfect that they totally transcended the medium. They transitioned seamlessly from print straight to the screen. His works absolutely dominated the 1960s and 70s television landscape, particularly through the BBC's legendary Ghost Story for Christmas series. Adaptations of his work like A Warning to the Curious brought his brand of creeping dread to millions of people, proving that a well-managed crescendo works just as well visually as it does on paper. Because ultimately, as this quote from M.R. James reveals, this was the true goal of the English ghost story all along. He wanted the reader to sit there and think, if I'm not very careful, something of this kind may happen to me. The entire architecture of the genre, the familiar settings, the skeptical narrators, the slow crescendos, it was all built to bring the horror directly out of the book and right into the safety of your own everyday life.
Which leaves us with this final, kind of unsettling thought to take away from this explainer today. As you look at the dark corners of your own home tonight, what shadows are waiting to be noticed? Thank you so much for joining me to uncover the anatomy of these incredible stories. Stay curious, keep learning, and sleep well.